Hi, everyone. Good evening and welcome to Kaplan Medical's Medical School Admissions Consulting session tonight, letters of recommendation and extracurricular activities, your questions answered. My name is Dr. Matt Alvin, and I am one of Kaplan's admissions consultants. I'm also a radiology resident at the Johns Hopkins Hospital here in Baltimore. But before all of that, I was one of you. I applied through medical school, and unfortunately, the first time I applied, I didn't get in. I was left with a lot of questions, but what helped me was turning to Kaplan. Kaplan helped me to do better on the MCAT, get my application stronger, and I came back and got into a great medical school. And here I am today, here on the other side, working with other Kaplan medical admissions consultants to help you write your success story. And so that begins tonight with focusing on letters of recommendation and extracurricular activities. Now, we got a great session planned for you tonight. Joining me tonight, who I'll introduce to you in a second, Maria Loftus, decades of admissions experience, tons of great tips that you're going to hear from somebody on the inside who knows the best about it. One of the things we want to say at the start of this session is this is an interactive session. So all throughout tonight, feel free to ask your questions. We have a lot of great teachers who are working in the background to field us your questions. It's a modified chat, so not every question you ask is going to be public to everybody, so don't feel afraid to ask us anything. Don't hesitate. That's what we're here tonight to do for you. So with that, let's jump right in. Again, joining me tonight, let me introduce you to Maria Loftus. Maria, take it away.
Thank you so much, Matt, and welcome. Particularly to the dads out there in the audience, we'd like to extend a very special welcome to you, and I hope you have a lovely Father's Day today. My name is Maria Loftus. I am the former Assistant Dean of Recruitment and Admissions at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine. I was there for about 20 years. During that time, I had the amazing opportunity to represent all of the Western medical schools, that's Colorado West, to the National Committee on Admissions, which is a standing committee of the Association of American Medical Colleges. After representing my colleagues for a number of years, I became chair of that committee. Now, the role of the Committee on Admissions is to promulgate best practices in admissions and then to share those best practices with admissions committees across the country. What I found to be particularly fascinating was just how different every school ran their admissions process. You know, you would think that maybe the Association of American Medical Colleges dictates to schools how they're going to review applications, or if a school's within a particular system, like mine was within the University of California, you would think that maybe the regents tell us what to do. But that's not the case. Admissions practices and policies are put together by the faculty at a given medical school. And so there is quite a bit of variability from school to school. So like I said, that was really interesting to find out how everybody else ran their admissions process. So I retired a couple of months ago, and now I get to do what I really enjoy doing the most. And that is demystifying the application process and working with applicants one-on-one to help them put together their most compelling application. Because I have found that when you know what's expected of you and you know how something works, you're much more likely to be successful. So if, as you go through the application process, you need a little help here and there or a coach, just know that we're here to help. So with that in mind, let's get started with tonight's presentation. So we are going to start with looking at the different admissions factors, the different things that will go into making the admissions decision at any medical school. They're all going to look at the MCAT scores, your undergraduate GPA, your undergraduate institution, your application essays, your work and activities, your letters of recommendations, and of course, the interview. But as I mentioned earlier, How they look at these different factors is going to vary from school to school. And we do have another presentation that we do on just that. So if you've got questions, hopefully you can catch one of our future presentations on the application process. We're also going to take a very brief look at the timeline. Ideally, you've got your MCATs taken by now if you're planning on applying this summer. And the reason that you'd like to have your MCATs done by the time you apply is you'd like your application to be complete so that the admissions committees can begin looking at your application in totality. They begin, you can begin filing your application through AMCAS, ACOMAS, or the Texas Medical School application service beginning in the May-June timeframe. Between the three primary application servicers, they all start opening up their application for you to start filling it out in May. And depending upon what the date is in May, some of them actually allow you to begin sending your application in. Once you have sent your application to the application servicer, and again, that's going to be AMCAS for most of the MD medical schools, ACOMAS for most of the DO medical schools, or TMD SAS for most of the Texas medical schools, whether they're allopath or osteopath. Once they get your application, they are going to be verifying your academic history, and that typically takes about a month for them to do that. And that's, of course, assuming you've got your transcripts in to them so that they can verify your academic history. But it does take about a month, so the schools don't begin to get the applications until the end of June, going forward into the summer. So they will begin sending out secondary applications. And the secondary application is where the medical school is asking specifically for questions that they've got, information that they want that's very important to them. Typically, this is where you'll be asked to send your letters of recommendations in, and you'll do that through the application servicer. You'll also probably be asked to write additional essay or essays, depending upon the individual medical school. They'll also, at this point, at the secondary, start to look at your work and activities. That will start happening towards, as I said, the end of July into August, and again, going forward. As the secondaries are returned, then a decision is made who is going to be invited for an interview. And the interviews will start middle to the end of September, with the first acceptances going out in the general acceptance pool beginning October 15th. And I say the general acceptance pool because if you've applied early decision to medical school, those acceptances have to be out by October 1st. And applying early decision is where you're just applying to one medical school. And because you're only applying to one medical school, you get that answer fairly quickly. And that way you can turn around and apply to other medical schools if you did not receive an acceptance. Then acceptances will continue to go out from October 15th through about March 15th. The rules to us are that we have to have filled the class one time over, meaning, let's say you've got 100 positions in the medical school class, they have to have sent out at least 100 acceptances by March 15th. But between March 15th and the time school begins, literally there's at least another 100% turnover because initially we've all accepted the same people. So there are a lot of people who will come off of the alternate list between March 15th and the time school begins. But it is, the later your application is complete, the later your application is reviewed by the admissions committees, the greater the probability that you're really just applying for an alternate list spot. So ideally, you want to get your MCATs taken and out of the way early. You want to get your application in a timely manner. And of course, you want to turn those secondaries around as quickly as possible. Matt, did you?
Yeah. So this is a really big thing, guys, just to focus on the timeline. I know it's just kind of a little bit generic, like before we jump into the letters and the extracurriculars, but we like to start each presentation talking about the timeline because of how important it is. Speaking as somebody, when I was in your shoes, what I did was I took the MCAT at the end of June, didn't get my score back till the end of July, actually waited until then to apply. I was a little bit worried at that outset, but truly, you will see that your probability is higher of getting an interview at perhaps one of those schools that you considered as a reach school, or school kind of out of what you thought you could get the earlier that you apply. Now, we're getting a few questions that are kind of rolling in here. Sorry, just to kind of jump on some of these. So Lauren asks us, can you apply early decision to one AMCAS and apply to multiple AAC or MAS at the same time? So it's my understanding that the EDP is across all applications, and that you apply to one and you're agreeing to not apply to any AMCAS or any non-AMCAS school at once. It kind of is a whole blanket of things. Maria, is that your understanding as well?
Yes, that is my understanding. However, I will also be honest and say there's no way for a non-AMCAS medical school to know what's happening in AMCAS and vice versa. There's no way for an AMCAS school to know whether or not you've applied through ACOMAS or the Texas application system. So you are on your honor to only be applying to one school.
Which is a big thing. I mean, just remember, being on your honor before you're even granted, the right to be a medical student. If somebody were to find out that you did something that wasn't honorable, it would just look poorly against you. So you just need to take that as one school and only one school to follow the guidelines appropriately. Now, we had somebody ask about a GPA question here. So one of our students here currently goes to pharmacy school. It's considered grad school. Do they only look at my undergrad GPA? So they're going to actually look at all of your GPAs, John. That's kind of like whether or not you do a post-bac. I mean, there's people that'll come in and do a master's, of biology, anatomy, one-year programs here or there. The admissions committees are going to look at all of your GPAs. I do think that they do separate them from undergrad to grad. Maria, you'd be able to probably provide a little more experience on that.
Yes, so when the medical schools get your application, they do see as a line item your freshman grades, your sophomore, your junior, your senior, your post-bac, and then there's a line for cumulative, and then any graduate school grades. Then it's up to the individual medical school as to what they're going to count and how they're going to count it. Post-bac grades are automatically averaged in with your undergraduate GPA and therefore will automatically count to some extent. The graduate school grades are intentionally separated out because many medical schools do not count those, even though they see them. They don't count the graduate school grades when they're compiling how many points do you earn for your academic history. The reason for this is, while we do have a good sense of grade inflation from undergraduate program to undergraduate program, and when I say program, I mean the institution itself, not your major, we do not have a good sense of that for the graduate programs. And the reason we don't is because there's not a lot of people going to graduate school and then applying to medical school. Additionally, if we were to be jaded about it, for the most part, graduate school grades are considered to be somewhat inflated in that in many programs, just getting a B is about the lowest grade that is given. So, well, again, the admissions committee certainly see your graduate school grades, and it very well may have a positive influence on them because you've taken some additional education that will give you that many more skills and knowledge to be a physician. Those grades themselves may not count in your academic history. Matt, back to you. Or are we ready to move on now?
Let's just jump in to the topic.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to now move on to letters of recommendations, and we're going to start just by talking about the different types of letters of recommendations, of which you may not have these available to you. So the first type is called the committee letter, and this is actually a letter that is written by your undergraduate institution. It used to be quite common that undergraduate campuses provided this service, and medical schools really appreciated it because we got to know your pre-med advisor, your pre-med committee. We knew that they had a very good sense of the applicant pool at that institution and that they could give us your ranking relative to everyone else that was applying from your institution that year. But the reality is today that a lot of medical schools, a lot of undergraduate campuses simply do not have the resources available to be able to offer those services anymore. So while you will see the medical schools indicate that they would like to see a committee letter, that's only if you have a committee letter available at your institution. If you don't, then don't worry about it. So there's also another type of letter that comes out of the pre-med office, and that's called a letter packet. And this is just a standardized, prefabricated letter that's put on top of your packet. And that prefab letter, if you will, that goes on top, gives a little information about your institution. It might tell on average how many applicants are applying from that institution in the past, what their average GPA or MCAT scores are. So it's just a cover letter giving general information about the institution, nothing specific about you. And then there's your individual letters that you've had written by your faculty. The third type is where you are compiling individual letters and you're having those letters directly sent to the application servicer, because whether it's AMCAS, ACOMAS, or the Texas application schools that you're applying to and through that application service, they all have a letter of recommendation file service, so that your letter writers would just send their letters directly there, and then they are distributed to the medical schools. And that saves your letter writers a lot of work. It used to be that they would have to send their letters out to each of the schools that you were applying to, and now they just have to send the one letter, and it's distributed by the application servicer. Matt, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so just starting this large discussion on letters of recommendation, guys, it's definitely a lot. I find that with a lot of my discussions with students, especially over the past few weeks, but over the past 10 years or so that I've been with Kaplan, letters are often an overlooked component of the application simply because of how much effort is needed for them. Just take it from the outset that you guys are depending on other people when you're thinking about letters of recommendation. First, as we see on this opening slide here, we got to figure out, well, does your school have a pre-med committee that writes a letter? Is there letter packets that go out, or do you just get individual letters? When I was doing this process, I had absolutely no idea. Sure, I had a pre-health committee, but they didn't tell me off, the first thing of, well, Matt, you have to use this committee, or we do it like this until, I started looking into it. So that's why, it's never too early to kind of look into this. But the first step is, if you guys have a pre-health committee at your school, get in touch with them and ask, hey, is there a committee letter that's actually done for this? Because if there is, as we talked about, you got to use the letter. Somebody asked if we don't have a committee letter or letter packet, do we need to explain why? No, you don't, just because the schools really don't care. They just want your letters. So it's one of those things where when I was applying, I did individual letters. And as long as they got the letters, as long as AMCAS said, hey, we got your letters, we're going to forward them on for you, great, that's all that matters. You don't need to explain one way, shape, or form. It varies by, college one versus college two. Even some colleges have decided to get rid of the committee letter. It's something that is the first thought at the outset when you're thinking of, okay, who's going to write me these letters, to figure out, how do I do it this way, shape, or form. We had another question come in, do you need separate letters for each school you apply to? So I think we're going to go into that a little bit here in terms of the differences in the application, but the quick answer to that is no, you don't need separate letters for each school you apply to, but it depends, as you'll see, as we'll talk about probably in the next few slides. AMCAS works in the sense where you can send in up to 10 letters. So when I was applying, I sent in 6, but of those 6, I actually only used 4. So 2 of the letters I didn't even use, simply because I just wanted to get a lot of letters and feel out the vibe of my letter writers, again, as we'll talk about tonight, versus the other application services like the AACOMAS, where any letter you upload is going to get sent to the actual medical school. AMCAS, you can pick which letters go to which school if you want to, but you don't necessarily have to. Maria, back to you.
So I would like to say one more thing about the question, if you don't have a committee letter or committee package, you need to explain. And of course, as Matt said, the answer is no, you don't need to explain that because we know that your undergraduate school does not have that service available. But let's take the flip side of that question. What if your undergraduate campus does provide that service and you are bypassing? That you may be very well asked to explain by the different medical schools, because we know which schools have a committee letter available. And this is going to be particularly for the committee letter. If you have bypassed your committee letter and one is available, then it looks as though you're bypassing your pre-med advisor because you don't want them to tell us something about you. So if you've got a pre-med committee letter available, you should be taking advantage of that service. And if you don't, you're going to have to explain it. So moving right along. So how do you know what the medical school, which medical school requires what kind of letter of recommendation? The first thing you do in terms of research is you go to the MSAR database on the AMCAS website. And I have to tell you that the $28 subscription that you will pay for the database, a one-year subscription to the MSAR database, is the best $28 you are probably ever going to spend. So not only does that database give you average GPA and MCAT scores of the different medical schools, but when you go to the individual schools' web page on the MSAR database, it will go through and it tells you all sorts of information from, how many primary applications do they receive, what exactly are their pre-med requirements, what percentage of the accepted students had shadowing experience or other clinical experience. It goes on and on and on in terms of all the details about that school's requirements in entering class statistics. But one of the things it does is it tells you exactly what's in their secondary application, and specifically in regards to the letters of recommendation is what are their letter of recommendation requirements. Because from medical school to medical school, some medical schools ask for something outside of the norm. Now the norm is that schools are going to ask you for 3 letters of recommendations if you don't have a pre-med committee letter. And those 3 letters, generally speaking, are coming from academics who have taught you, and 2 of them are science, 1 of them may be a non-science. But there are lots of variations. There are medical schools that are going to ask for more letters. There are medical schools that are going to ask for something other than 2 science and 1 non-science letter. So you need to do your research ahead of time. You can also find this same sort of information in the Osteopathic Medical College Information Book. Now, unfortunately, the osteopathic schools don't have the same sort of robust database that is available through the MSAR on the AMCAS website, but you still can get all the information that you're going to need. You can also individually go to each school's website and read what their letter of recommendation requirement is. And if you are working with your pre-med office, they probably have a copy of last year's secondary application from every medical school in the country. So you can just go and visit your pre-med office and take a look at the secondary application to determine what the individual letter of recommendation requirements are for the schools that you're planning to apply to. Matt, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so this is just another great piece of the puzzle here, and guys, this is definitely something one-on-one in our sessions together that we spend a lot of time going over as part of the admissions consulting. Is number one, picking out the right letters, because I see there's a lot of questions kind of coming in, which I promise that we're going to get to in the presentation with who specifically to select for the letters and how to do it. Trust me, we've got all those tips coming up for you here. But part of it, again, is figuring out with the MSAR, especially. I mean, believe me, $28 is a steal for that thing. It goes over so much stuff. And one of the things is what letters does the school need? And that's a big thing, because it's one thing for us to say, hey, you guys get your 2 science letters, 1 9-science letter. That should cover the majority of schools, but generally, I always like to advise my students to get at least 1 more than you think you might need, if possible, because for a variety of reasons. One, if one of the people you asked procrastinates to no end and you never end up getting the letter. But 2, in case at the last minute you see, oh no, the MSAR says that school needs 4, and you don't want to, have a school crossed off on your list simply because you forgot to get a letter. So, always just sit down, as we would do one-on-one, thinking about who can write you these letters, and thinking from a wide variety of areas. Now, 2 questions that came in that are pretty similar, which definitely are great questions here because it's a confusing thing. Does the committee letter count only as 1 letter? And are the individual letters in the committee letter, do I need to get those separately? So it's my understanding that 1, AMCAS considers the committee letter as 1 letter. But, and again, Maria can jump in on this too, speaking as a former admissions director, since the committee letter contains all of the individual letters that you need and hopefully satisfied for the requirement for the schools, you wouldn't need to separately then upload those individual letters to the actual AMCAS, just because then I think it would get pretty repetitive for the actual medical school going through those. Maria, have you seen stuff like this?
Yes, Matt, you were absolutely correct. It starts out, AMCAS counts the pre-med committee letter as 1, and many undergraduate campuses, the pre-med office will send not only the pre-med committee letter, but may also be sending along individual letters if you have solicited individual letters. So that entire packet, no matter how many letters it has in it, counts as 1 letter for AMCAS. And so you could send completely different letters, additional letters, but you don't need to. All the medical schools are going to take a pre-med committee letter or packet as fulfilling their requirement, unless they've got something that's very, very specific that they're looking for, say a research letter that you have not already have as part of your packet, then you would want to send that additionally. But as Matt said, we're going to be going over all of this in a little bit more detail in a couple of more minutes. So we'll just reinforce the things we've already said.
And just to reiterate, because for some of you, I'm sure, have already done this process and, probably in the midst of applying, but we know that, with these sessions that a lot of you might not be in the application process now. Maybe you're applying next year, maybe 2 years from now. And this is not something, to wait until the last minute to do. I just want to reiterate this again. Working on your letters is a thing to do early on. It's something that, when I meet with students in the fall before they're applying in the summer, I tell them, you got to sit down and start thinking about who's going to write you these letters, because you have to be strategic about it. Part of it is thinking about the end game. And so, thinking about like 2 years, 1 to 2 years down the road, it's a smart thing for you guys to be able to take this all in and say, who would write me a good letter? What will that school actually go for? Just so then in your classes that you take now, next semester, your activities that you're doing, these are things that you can think about for, maybe that person might be a good letter writer, maybe that might be a good letter. And check with your pre-med office, because sometimes they are able to hold on to a letter early on so that you don't just have to wait until May of the application cycle for all your letter writers to get stuff in. For example, say that, in your freshman year, like say that you're a freshman now, okay, and you have a great class with somebody and you want them to write you a letter, they can write you a letter right then and there, so that they get their ideas on paper, and then you can meet with them again closer to the application cycle to, see if there's anything to update to the letter as such. But again, all the stuff that we're telling you here, it applies to all of you, no matter where you're at in the application cycle. It's never too early to start doing it. And I know we had a question about if you hadn't taken the MCAT yet, should you still be working on this and could you submit the application? Yeah, this is something where even if you haven't taken the MCAT yet, we want you to be working on this stuff.
Okay, so let's now turn to talking about the letter writers themselves. Who are the right people to be writing your letters? Most medical schools, as we've already mentioned, require 2 science professors and 1 non-science. And when they say science, what they mean is biology, chemistry, or physics. These are the pre-med requirements, which is why the medical schools want you to get letters from the faculty who teach the pre-med students. These people have a depth of experience that someone teaching a upper level biology course in, ornithology or cell biology may not be seeing the breadth of pre-med students. And so when those people say that you're one of the best applicants they've ever seen, it's not that they're not telling the truth, it's just that they haven't seen that many pre-med students. So medical schools, again, are very specific about who they want to have writing your letters of recommendation. And your job is to give them exactly what they're asking for. So a question that we get a lot is, I didn't really get to know my faculty member because I was sitting in a class of 500 students. And when you're talking about the pre-med requirements, at many of those schools, those are freshman, sophomore, lower division courses that are very, very large lecture courses. Well, ideally, you would have gotten to know your professor. But if you didn't, and you did get to know your TA, it is perfectly acceptable to have the letter written and co-signed by both. It is not okay to send a letter just from a TA. Going back to the same principle that your TA simply does not have the breadth of experience in which to be able to consider your application relative to the applicant pool. So you can't just send a letter written by a TA, but you certainly can send a letter that is co-signed by the faculty member. And it needs to be someone who's given you a letter grade, as opposed to someone that you took a independent research project from, or you took a pass-fail class from. Again, this is just what the medical schools are looking for. Additionally, you might want to send some other letters, and the kinds of letters that you might want to send in addition to are going to be if you've done research and you're not applying to an MD PhD program, because if you were, you're going to be required to send a research letter. But let's just say you're applying to a straight MD or DO program, but you have a lot of quality research in your background, then you very well may want to send a letter from the PI. And again, if the PI you didn't interact with as much as you did the postdoc, it's okay that the letter is co-signed by the 2 individuals. You also might want to send a letter from a clinical experience, a physician that you shadowed, an employer, a volunteer coordinator, a significant activity in your background that you learned a lot from that activity, absolutely feel free to include that additional letter of recommendation, not in substitution of the 3 letters that the medical schools have asked you for, but in addition to. And then lastly, if on your meaningful activities, one of your 3 meaningful activities that you've listed and written about in your application, if you want to get a supervisor from one of those activities to write your letter of recommendation, I think that would be a good idea also, because after all, you identified this as being an activity that you learned a lot about yourself, you developed, you changed, that you developed characteristics and qualities and perspectives that are going to help you as a future physician. So that's going to make a great letter also. Matt?
Yeah, so this is a lot of, great info on the who of letter writers, guys. And, we're definitely going to talk about the when, the how, and what to put in it coming up in the next few slides here. But to focus on the who, so as Maria's been chatting about here, the science professors, it can be a difficult thing. So I went to a Big Ten school, go Big Ten, but that obviously means I was in classes of like 200 students in a lecture, right? Something like that. Versus, I had small group discussion sessions twice a week with the TA. I got to know my TA well, and then flip-flop 2 years later, I was a TA. I got to know my students really well in a chemistry class. Where, they didn't go to office hours. There was a good number of people that didn't go to office hours. And so they didn't get a chance to know, the actual professors all that well. So what do you do in that scenario? It's very tough. One of it is, it starts with saying, when you're asking yourself, could this person write you a strong letter? It's important when you guys see on Maria's PowerPoint here in the who of choosing the right people. That word right, it has to resonate with you so well here, because anybody could write you a letter, okay? Anybody, somebody that you walk up to on the street can write you a letter that says anything. But think about Maria, okay? Think about how many letters have come across her desk over the years, thousands. I mean, just imagine how many letters that she's read, and what are the ones that differentiate the students that she, wants to meet, wants to give that interview to the most. And it starts with the people that you picked. And so again, one of it is, working with these science letter writers. And I get it for some of you that are putting questions in here. Well, Matt, I've been out of school for 10 years or 5 years or, 2 years. What do I do about that? The answer is that, there is no easy answer. It's a difficult answer. And, we'll talk a little bit how, the how of getting in touch with them, but it does require you to get in touch with them, meet with them, chat with them over the phone, talk with them, taking that initiative, all these little bits of advice. Some of you are asking about people of who the non-science letter can come from. Does it have to be a professor? No. So, again, this goes by school to school specifics, which will, direct you to the MSAR for. But for example, when I was applying, I had my typical science professors that co-signed with TAs, just as when I was a TA, I co-signed with a professor because I knew my students more. And then people outside of the classroom, non-science letters. So my volunteer coordinator that I did lots of volunteering with, my research coordinator that I did a lot of research with, but these were in classes. They didn't necessarily need to have the rank of professor. They simply needed to know me on that personal level. Those are the people that you want to think about. Those are who we are going to work with you one-on-one to try to identify. It's one of the biggest strategic parts of the application, informing who are you going to pick. So similarly, Sydney asked you if you worked with a graduate student instead of a postdoc, is it okay to have them co-sign with the PI as well? Generally, yes, if you feel that they are, providing a lot of, good experience with you, right? So like I had a letter from a research doc that, was co-signed by a graduate student, okay, because I worked one-on-one with the graduate student. The biggest thing is that, you have somebody, the professor title on the letter, okay, besides that graduate student, such that, people understand, admissions committees understand that, you're working one-on-one with these graduate students or postdocs kind of, maybe more than the actual professor itself. And then Hannah asked, would non-traditional students also have to look into a committee letter if doing postdoc at a certain school? Yeah, so, there's a lot of, complex questions I think we can put here. But, to kind of like generalize an answer to that, Hannah, is number one, I would go to, where you're getting your letters from. So like the college that you're getting your main letters from, versus if where you're doing the postdoc at a completely different school that's separate from your college, and you're just asking a letter from them, that's probably going to be considered a separate letter, again, because it's separate from that committee. And so that's the way I would treat it. Maria?
I think the only thing I would add to that is if the post-bac program that you are going to is where you're doing all of your pre-med requirements, which is typically when you go to a post-bac program, that's what it means, then I would expect that you would get your letters of recommendations from them, because that's where you're doing your pre-med requirements. But certainly if you're just gone back to do a single course and the majority of your pre-med requirements were done earlier at another institution, then you're going to need to go back to that earlier institution, because that's where the majority of your science classes are coming from.
And yeah, so with what one last question that just came in here, just to clarify, non-science professor can be anybody. So just to clarify what we mean here, because again, it differs from school to school. So when Maria has on her slide here, most med schools require 2 science letters and 1 non-science letter. What that usually means is 2 classroom science, BCPM, professors, docs, whoever that's actually teaching the class. 1 non-science letter can vary, that some schools may say, hey, we want a non-science classroom teacher. So say that you did a class in, poetic writing, something like that, separate from science. That would be an example of a letter that fulfills that. But non-science letter can also mean from outside of the classroom, depending on what the school says in the requirements. And I would strongly recommend to all of you here that if you can get letters from people outside of the classroom, that is a major component of your application, because the classroom component generally is saying, yes, Audrey is amazing. She got an A in my class, really speaking about your academic prowess for medical school. But then talking about Sydney worked with me one-on-one, Habitat for Humanity, these months, we did this together. This is what she provided. This is what she gained from it, or Nikit worked in my lab. He did these projects one-on-one, showing his efficiency, his desire to provide more to the field. Again, these are the differences in what a letter writer from the classroom can give you guys from a letter writer outside the classroom can give you guys. So, again, as we talked about, this is something that we'll go through in our one-on-one sessions together, but it's important you guys plan strategically for who's going to write these letters.
So now let's turn to logistics. When do you ask for letters of recommendations? Well, as Matt has said, if as a freshman, a sophomore, a junior, that you have established a very strong rapport with a faculty member, that you've done very well in that class, perhaps you went on to TA or to volunteer in the lab if it was a faculty member who did research, then certainly you could start to gather these letters early. However, at the time you apply to medical school, they need to have a current date on them. They don't need to rewrite their letter, but the medical schools, we want to know that the letter writer still feels the same way about you today as they did then. So don't hesitate to go ahead and start to put together your packet of letters. Just know you might have to go back and get a current date. For those of you who you're going to be applying this next year, and when I say that, I mean you're going to submit your application next year, then certainly by the spring, no later than the spring of next year, you would want to be gathering your letters of recommendations. For those of you who are currently entering the application cycle this summer for the fall of next year, if you haven't gathered your letters of recommendations yet, you certainly want to get on that right away. Because as you may have already discovered, faculty oftentimes go away for the summer and you don't want them leaving town without having done your letter of recommendation. So again, ideally you're going to do this a couple of months ahead of when you need them so that you give the letter writers plenty of time to actually write their letter. An emergency on your part does not constitute an emergency on their part. So you want to be respectful of their time. Now, how to ask? Well, ideally, you can do this either in person because you already have a relationship with this individual, or perhaps by email. And you're going to want to explain to them why you value their opinion. And it may be that this was a faculty member who really brought the sciences to life for you, that really made you first start to think about going to medical school, someone that you found to just be a really good instructor, and that those are qualities that you hope to bring into your medical practice. You know, so stop and think about, why are you asking someone for a letter of recommendation, and share your admiration for them with them. And ask if they can write you a good letter of recommendation. And if they show any hesitation, like saying, you know, I am now a editor on my discipline's journal, and so I'm really, really busy. Or they say, you know, I'm going to be out of town traveling this semester. Or they, you know, say anything that in any way indicates a hesitation on their part, then say thank you very much and go on to your next possible letter writer. Because while it could very well be that they're just really, really busy, that they would love to write you a letter of recommendation, but they're really busy, they might also be saying, no, actually, I don't think I could write you a strong letter of recommendation, because either they don't really feel that they know you, or they just don't enjoy writing letters of recommendations and they don't feel that this is part of their job. Whatever the reason, that's not the person you want writing your letter of recommendation. So you give somebody the opportunity to gracefully bow out, and you take that and you move on. You also want to prompt them with the qualities or competencies that you would like them to mention in their letter of recommendation. Not that you're writing the letter of recommendation for them, not that you're putting words into their mouth, but it's perfectly okay to say, you know, I'm hoping that you can touch upon this and this and this. So medical schools are looking for a number of competencies in future physicians. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then you want to go to the AMCAS website and just type in essential qualities, or I'm sorry, not qualities, but competencies, essential competencies, AAMC or AMCAS, either one, and into Google, and you will get taken to the list of competencies that were promulgated by the Committee on Admissions and were adopted by the AAMC and have been adopted by many medical schools. And even the medical schools that haven't adopted those competencies, I can assure you they're still looking for these competencies in their future medical students. So you might go through that list of competencies and say that here's one that you think that your letter writer can speak to. For instance, there is problem-solving skills, there is teamwork, there is empathy, there is cultural competency, there's all sorts of things that we are looking for that your faculty member may very well have been able to observe in you based upon the nature of the relationship that you have with them. Again, if you were a TA, if you were working in their lab, if you came to see them during office hours. So if you can just remind them of these qualities and that you're hoping they can speak to them, then I'm sure they'll put those into your letters. You're going to want to provide them with all the backup material that they need, such as your transcripts, your resume, your application, a copy of your personal statement. Give them everything you can think of so that they can reference that information and incorporate it into their letter of recommendation, because it's going to make it sound like they know you just that much better. And of course, you will be asking for this letter a couple of months ahead of time. And so you'll send out a reminder very gently, just asking if there's any additional information that you can provide to them as the deadline is coming up. And once you know that the letter has been sent off, then you're going to want to follow that up with not only a thank you letter, but keep them posted. When you get accepted to a medical school, make sure that they know that they played a role in your success. Matt?
This is great, guys. This is, a lot of great tips that are being put in here, because honestly, I think this slide represents one of the most difficult parts of the application. For those of you that are in the application now, you probably understand what I mean. And for those who don't, just think about it in the sense of, you are, writing an application to medical school, your dream to be a doctor, and going through this arduous process. And part of it is depending on this group of people to write you letters that are glowing letters of recommendation to impress people like Maria to the point where she's going to be like, man, I want to invite Matt to come and interview. Hopefully, I'm just praying in the background. Please let me get the invite. And so the how to ask can sometimes be the most difficult part. It's not difficult if, you've got a great relationship with the teacher, which, hey, for some of you that may not be going to big schools and have small classes, maybe you've gotten to know the teachers really well, coordinators, research mentors. Maybe for some of you, this seems like a piece of cake. But believe me, especially for those of you that are with us tonight that are non-traditional applicants, who've been out of school for a long time and are struggling with, man, how do I, get in touch with these professors who, haven't basically heard from me in a long time, and ask them to write me a great glowing letter on my behalf. So just like Maria has on this slide here, and as she was telling you guys, it's all about arming them with as much ammunition as possible. Number one, providing them with all of your backgrounds. Okay, you taking the initiative, even going beyond an email if possible. Obviously, in the world we live in, starting with email is great, but if you could get in touch with them and say, hey, I want to set up a meeting with you to talk about the potential for you to write me a letter, if they say that they'd be willing to write you a letter. I think starting off with an email and asking them, but then from there, be the one that takes the initiative, talk with them over the phone if you're out of town, or if you're in town, meet with them. Short meeting, 10 to 15 minutes, just so they put a face to the name again. Tell them, why this is important to you, why that you think they're going to be a great letter writer for you, what you hope that they can write in the letter for you. But one of the most sensitive topics, as Maria alluded to here, was the reminder, which is a scary thing because people procrastinate. Never underestimate the ability of somebody to procrastinate, which is why we always recommend starting on getting your letter writers as early as you can, because you just don't know what can happen. Maybe the person has a family emergency. Maybe they get to go on a sabbatical for 4 months to the Greek Isles and, have no email access. Who knows? Maybe they win the lottery. So, giving them a deadline, okay, like being able to say, hey, you think you could have this to me like in a month and a half, something like that. Just work with them. Again, this is something that if it gets close to the application, you haven't heard from them, well, what do? You can shoot them an email, hopefully remind them gently, but then what if they don't get back to you? Then you send them another reminder, and then you feel like, oh, I don't want to be that person nipping at the heels and, trying to annoy them. But this is stuff that happens. I've dealt with, tons of students over the years who have told me both good stories and horror stories. And that's part of why we're here, to try to illuminate you on these things so that you're ready and can approach them, be prepared as much as you can. And I think a few more comments will kind of come ahead in the next slide on substance, Maria.
Okay, so now we're going to look at the substance. What do we want to see in those letters of recommendations when we're reading them on our end? So first and foremost, it's the context. How does this person know you, and who are they? So why should we on the admissions committee, why should we care about their opinion? And as we've already said, one of the things that the admissions committees are looking for is for the letter writer to have a breadth of experience with pre-med students, so that when they say you're one of the best and the brightest they've ever seen, and that you have all of these stellar qualities, that we know they know what they're talking about, because they have seen applicants after applicants after applicants. So we want to know who they are and how they know you. We want them to be able to speak knowledgeably about your skills, your qualities, your essential competencies, because a bad letter of recommendation isn't just something that says something negative. A bad letter of recommendation is a letter that says that you were fourth in the class of 500 and therefore have shown the necessary intellectual skills to become a proficient physician. Well, we already know that you got an A in the class. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for them to be able to speak to your qualities, your competencies, those essential competencies that medical schools are looking for, and any special skills or knowledge that you may have outside of your classroom performance. So that does require, hopefully, that they've gotten to know you and observe you. And we want to know why they think that that's going to make you an exceptional medical school candidate. And of course, you do not send letters for people who are going to be vague, who can only write a couple of sentences, really talking more about themselves than about you. Do not send us a letter from a relative. Do not send us a letter from a politician who doesn't know you, except that you pay tax dollars, or your parents are big donors to them. And every year I would get letters from politicians who had essentially said, I really don't know this individual, but I've heard great things, and I'm sure they'll make a great physician. And if anything, a letter from a politician that was like that was just annoying to us. It shows more judgment on the part of the applicant, and it felt like they were trying to intimidate us. So that's a big no-no. Don't send those letters. Matt, do you have anything to add?
The biggest piece of advice that I can give you guys is concrete experiences. Concrete experiences are huge when it comes to writing letters of recommendation. So what that means is, when you're thinking about who can write you a letter, think about, have you had real, concrete, specific experiences, similar to in your personal statement that you flush out with experiences? How can a letter writer connect with Maria? How can they connect with an admissions director beyond just, yeah, sure, I know, Sydney like this, or I know Audrey because she's a great student in the classroom. Like, have you had experiences with them, even as little as, Matt came to my office hours this one time to talk about the bonding energy of carbon and hydrogen. And, we talked about this, and this is what came through. I saw his desire because of this. That is better than just saying, Matt is a strong student, he got an A in my class. So thinking about these things, and when you meet with the letter writers, flushing out these experiences, writing them down for them so that you can say, here's some stuff that we did together, so that you're helping them. You're not saying you have to write this in the letter, but you can give them some examples of what they can put in it. So some questions that are coming through. Is it okay if you have a letter rec from a professor whose class you struggled in, but have a good relationship with the professor? That's a tough question. It's a tough question indeed, and I'll be excited to hear Maria's take on it. But from my take, my first thought is, whoever you're asking for a letter of recommendation, you probably want to have a really good grade in their class in, because then they can talk about how, yeah, you did well in their class from the academic standpoint. It's never a good idea, in my opinion, to come forth with any negative light in a letter, unless in this situation, like you're chatting about here, you're talking about a class that perhaps you struggled in, but then ended up like showing your hard work and it showed improvement throughout the class. That may be something that kind of comes through in a good light. Maria, your thoughts on that?
I totally agree, Matt. But one of the essential competencies that we're looking for is the capacity for self-improvement. So just as Matt said, that as long as you got at least a B in the class, and the faculty member can really speak to your capacity for self-improvement and how over the course of that quarter or semester that you were taking something that you didn't have a background in, and you really worked and showed a passion for the subject and for learning, then absolutely those are qualities that we're looking for. If it was that you struggled and at the end you were still struggling, that might not be the best letter. But I totally agree that if you actually improved over time and you finished strong, meaning at least to be in the class, and the faculty member can really speak to your qualities, that's going to be a great letter.
And then Anna jumps in here and asks us, if I work in healthcare, can I have a letter from a regular patient or their relative? So again, a good question. Personally, I've never heard that one before, but if I was in your shoes, Anna, I'd probably say no. Generally, when I think about letters of recommendation, I think about somebody in a supervisory role, somebody that has some sort of mentorship or leadership kind of above you, that can kind of like see things, from what you've been doing. And I just worry that a patient or the relative might not have a letter come across as you would want it to be. Maria might have seen this, so I'll be interested to see what she says.
To me, that kind of falls into the same category as a family member or a friend, or someone who just doesn't see the competition. So their opinion just doesn't have the same weight with us. We want these letters to be coming from someone who can speak to your qualities as they compare also to the competition. So, certainly there may be a circumstance in which this is a good additional letter to have filed away in case a medical school is asking for something different. There are some medical schools that sometimes just say, and you can send us an optional letter that speaks to your qualities. Then maybe you might want to use this, but certainly not as your core letters, because again, this person who would be writing the letter simply does not see the breadth of pre-medical students that are applying to medical school. Okay, so we've largely covered this slide already, so we're going to very quickly go through it. With MCAT, you can file up to 10 letters, and you can then say which letters go to which medical school. So medical school 1 may get letters A, B, and C, while medical school 2 gets A, F, and G. So that's a really nice way to go about doing it. And a letter with MCAT is either an individual letter, a committee letter, or a letter packet. With ACOMAS, it's 6 letters, up to 6 letters. All letters go to all schools, and in general, at least one of those letters needs to be from an osteopathic physician. And here's why. The osteopathic medical schools are tired of being thought of as second best. And lots of times that's what I think applicants originally, think. They think, well, I'll apply to an osteopathic school if I can't get into an allopathic school. And yet, the more they find out about the osteopathic schools, oftentimes they do find that it resonates much more with them and that they're actually much more inclined to apply to an osteopathic medical school. But the osteopathic schools want to know that you've actually investigated. What is the philosophy? What are the differences in the way the physicians practice their orientation towards practicing medicine? So they want you to get a letter from an osteopathic physician, and that's completely reasonable. And then with the Texas medical schools, their application service, it's 3 individual letters or your pre-med committee packet. And all letters go to all schools. And the Texas does give you the option of submitting 1 additional optional letter. Matt, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Not especially, just to focus on this with regards to the up to 10 letters for AMCAS. Just remember, everybody, that means that you don't have to have 10 letters. That seems like a lot, but even if you do get 10 letters, you don't need to use all of them. It's quite different from the other 2 application services where anything you upload, it gets used. But the other ones, but for AMCAS, you can upload however many you want, and you can direct, maybe these 2 letters to this school, maybe these 3 to that school. Just keep that in mind.
Okay, so here are some of the frequently asked questions that Matt and I and the other admissions consultants get a lot. And certainly as Dean of Admissions, here's the kinds of questions I would get asked by applicants all the time. So if I'm a reapplicant, do I need to get new letters of recommendations? And the answer is, just like we talked about earlier, they don't have to be new, but they need to have a new date on them. Matt, anything to add?
Well, that's just something that applies to me directly as well. Remember, like I said, guys, I got rejected the first year that I applied to med school. So I had to go through this process of getting all my letters renewed. And pretty much what that just took is sending an email to my letter writers and asking them, can you please just update the date? And, I, filled them in on what I had done between when I had last spoken with them to the point where now I was sending them an email just in case, they felt that they wanted to add something to the letter. Most people probably don't necessarily, just because it might not be interaction with them anything differently, but it's always a good idea, throughout the whole application process, I continually sent updates to my letter writers so they knew where I was in the application, how things were going. It's always just good to keep everybody in the loop with these things because you never know when you're going to need a friend, and a friend being one of your letter writers.
The next question that we get a lot of has to do with waiving your rights to read your letters of recommendations. And if you're going through your pre-med office, you'll be asked to complete a document as to whether or not you're waiving your rights to view your letters of recommendations with that office. And then again, when you file your letters through the application services, you'll be asked again. And then quite possibly at the medical school level, when you go for an interview, you may be asked again, because each step along the way wants to know legally whether you have access to your letters of recommendation or not. So here's the answer. If you actually want to go to medical school, you need to waive your rights to your letters of recommendations, because the presumption is that if you have not waived your rights, that means you have reviewed your letters of recommendations and you have either edited them, you've pulled out letters that weren't glowing, or that your letter writers have been negatively intimidated in such a way that they've only said good things about you because they know you're going to be reading these letters of recommendations. So I appreciate that it's scary. It's scary to not get to see what your letter writers are writing about you, that you've waived your rights, but that's really the only choice if you want those letters to be taken seriously. Now, I do want to point out that this is a separate issue. If you have waived your rights to your letters of recommendations, they are confidential in that you have no right to see them, And after the fact, your letter writer says, would you like a copy of the letter of recommendation? That's fine. You know, you can take that letter of recommendation. You have not breached your waiving of your rights, that you have no right to that letter of recommendation, and you have no right to make any changes to that letter of recommendation. But up front, it's that you're waiving your rights. Matt, do you want to add anything?
I totally agree. There's really nothing, to add with that, everybody. You have to waive your rights. It's as simple as that. And I know it's scary, as Maria said, but it's something where you are putting your faith in, these people to write you good letters. And that's why Kaplan and all of our consultants will tell you that you need to take the initiative and meet with them. And you need to do your due diligence to make sure that they write you a strong letter, and that's all that can be said.
Now, this is a question you've already been writing in about, which is, if you've been out of school for a while, do you still need to get letters from your undergraduate faculty? You need to get the letters that the medical schools are asking you for. And so if the medical schools are asking you for science letters and possibly a non-science faculty letter, and you don't have any recent coursework from which you can go get letters from those individuals because they fit the definition of what the school is looking for, the medical school is looking for, then yes, you have to go back and get letters from those undergraduate faculty. Again, you can supplement and give a medical school additional letters on top of what they've asked for, but you cannot substitute. If you substitute, you risk being rejected right there because you didn't give them what they wanted, and there's a reason why they've asked for what they've asked for. Matt?
That sounds pretty straightforward to me. Again, just focusing on what does the school want. That's the biggest piece of advice with this, is going back to what are the school requirements. I know that we had a question come in about different schools having different sets of competencies that they want, or are they similar? It's pretty similar between schools, but each school has their own mission statement that they put forth, and that's why part of the process is important to research the school and read about the school either on the MSAR or their website with regards to both letters and everything else for that matter.
The next two we've largely covered. My science professor doesn't know me. Do I still need to get a letter of recommendation from him or her? The answer is, if this is the kind of letter that the medical school is asking for, and that's your only option because you've only got this one class, then yes, you need to get a letter of recommendation from that individual. For those of you who won't be applying to medical school for a year or two, you've still got plenty of time to start establishing relationships with your faculty so that they will be in a position to write you a good letter of recommendation, that they will know you. For the rest of you, you need to do the things that we suggested, which is making contact with the professor, letting them know why they're important to you, why you value their opinion, and asking them if they can provide you with this letter. And here is all the background material that you will provide them so that they can write a letter for you. And then that last one is, are you at a disadvantage if you don't have a pre-med committee? The answer is no, you're at no disadvantage because medical schools know which undergraduate campuses have pre-med committees and write a pre-med committee letter and which don't. And if you don't have that available to you, no one is expecting you to create one out of thin air. But as I already had mentioned earlier, if you do have one available to you and you're not using it, getting a pre-med committee letter, you should expect that some medical school is going to ask you why. Matt, did you have anything to add?
Not on those two questions, but just before we move on to the activities section, just to cover a few of these questions that you guys are sending into us here. So first off, choosing a letter writer from a non-classroom experience. One of the students here asked, for that letter, should we make sure to choose that experience as a most meaningful experience? So we'll talk about the most meaningful experiences soon, but I would say that you don't have to. You don't have to correlate and say that, whoever you ask for a letter writer for an activity, you got to talk about that activity as the most meaningful. If it's most meaningful to you, then sure, but there's no absolute requirement to it. And then another question here, Tanya brings up, she's applying next year. She doesn't have her personal statement written yet. She's afraid if she doesn't ask for a letter of recommendation from her professor now, they might forget / not write as strong a letter a year from now. So my advice to you, Tanya, would be just to sit down with them and tell them about your situation and, ask them to start writing a letter / write the letter. It's just something to work longitudinally with, right? So rather than just sitting down for a one-time, 1 week, write me a letter and done, just tell them that this is where you're at in the cycle. You could just tell them why you want to go to medical school. You don't need to necessarily have the statement written if it's that early on and you're not applying until next year. But then when you do have the statement written, then you could sit down with them again. It's just a longitudinal process. Maria, any thoughts on that?
No, I totally agree. That's great advice, Matt.
Okay. And then just one last question before we move on. Is it okay to have a DO write you a letter of recommendation to be used on the MCAT? I think it's totally fine. Again, the admissions people who are reading your applications, they want letters from people that can, talk about you, right? The admissions directors want to know about you. So, as long as it's from somebody that, whether they're DO, MD, non-doctor, again, somebody besides the categories Maria and I have told you guys to avoid, as long as that they know you and are, talking about you well, then I think that's totally fine.
Okay, now we're going to turn to work and extracurricular activities. Let's start out with why they matter, and they do matter. They matter a lot. Medical schools want to know how you spend your time when you're not in class or studying. And they want to know that for two reasons. One is they want to know how you live your life, what's important to you, because what you do and how you do it tells us a great deal about what you value and what's important to you. And how many balls you can juggle in the air while maintaining your academic performance also tells us a lot about you. So we really want to know how you're spending the time. And if you don't tell us, our assumption is that you're studying all the time. And that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing in terms of being a well-rounded individual. And it's also not a good thing because when you go to medical school, there's not going to be anything more conceptually difficult than what you've had as an undergraduate, but the volume is so much more increased. Yeah, I'm sure you've heard that saying of it's like trying to drink water out of a fire hydrant. Well, it is. And so if you have been spending all of your time studying in order to maintain the grades that you've gotten, then our concern is that you won't possibly be able to maintain your level of academic performance once you get to medical school and the volume is increased. So let's go through the big three in terms of extracurricular activities that really there's some expectation that everybody will have, and then we'll talk about all the rest of the things. So the big three is clinical experience. We want you to know what you're getting into. And you've said you want to be a physician. Well, if you really want to be a physician, we would expect that you've been very anxious to see patients and that you have gone out of your way to not only shadow a physician, but have some sort of a clinical experience beyond just shadowing. We also would like to see some research experience. And when I say research experience, I don't mean that it has to be in a wet lab, unless, of course, you're applying for an MD, PhD program, in which case you better have research in that particular area that you're applying for the PhD side of the program. The reason we want to see research of any kind is because as a future physician, you are going to be responsible for your own continuing medical education. Yes, you will be responsible for getting continuing medical education credit. So you will go to formal programs to learn about new things. But on a daily basis, you will be reading journal articles because you want to keep up with the latest and greatest of what kinds of treatment options are available for your patients. And of course, you'll be seeing drug reps more than you ever want to, who will be giving out marketing material and literature, and you need to be able to sort through that. You will be a better consumer of other people's research if you have been through the process of research yourself. And again, doesn't have to be in a lab. It can be forensic research, it could be library research, it could be social sciences research, it can be any type of research that gives you some understanding of experimental design, of testing a hypothesis, of how statistics can be manipulated to prove just about anything. That's what we want you to have a sense of. And then teaching. Doesn't have to be being a TA in a university course, although that certainly would count, but it could also be teaching backyard swim. It could be teaching Sunday school. It could be teaching anything. And the reason we want to see teaching is you will be a teacher every day of your life as a physician, whether you go into academic medicine and teach medical students and residents or not. You are going to teach your patients. You are going to realize that it's up to you to modify your behavior in such a way for each of your patients that you can inspire them to participate in their own healthcare. Because what we die of in this country largely are lifestyle choices. We all know what it is we're supposed to do. We just don't do it. So as a physician, in order to really affect your patient's health, if you're talking about primary care, you need to be able to inspire that patient as to why they need to make lifestyle choices and changes and to get them inspired to do that. So we'd like to see that you've got teaching experience in your background and that you understand what that means to be a good teacher. Matt, do you have anything to add?
Not too much. I think that this pretty much covers everything. And I'm sure that some of our students watching are probably like, oh my gosh, I don't have one of the big three for, what am I going to do? So first thought is, don't freak out. To those of you who may be freaking out, if you feel like one of your big three categories isn't that big, because when I was applying, I had absolutely no shadowing. I certainly had clinical experience during volunteering. I did a lot of volunteering in the hospital, and that was, my exposure into the clinical foray. Some of the questions that we have coming here kind of deal with the clinical experience is that one of our students is going to be participating in something clinical during the summer, but he's going to be submitting his application kind of before that happens, and wondering if that's beneficial to put that on the application. So the activity section, just like the letters, it's something you guys don't want to underestimate, because one of the biggest mistakes that people make is doing an activity for a week and putting it on there and thinking, oh, well, that's one of the big three, I'm set, check mark. That's not how you want it to come across. Maria can, I'm sure, tell you many great stories about students who have put on there like 1 or 2 days on an activity, and that's not what admissions people are looking for. They're looking for commitment, and by commitment, we mean long-term. So generally, you're looking for 6-month plus activities for us to fit sort of a big three category. And that number can be variable depending on what you've done, but it's something where you don't want to just try to get away with saying, well, I've done this for a month, so that should be good for it. Now, certainly to answer your question, yeah, if you have room on the activities section for, one of the 15 that you want to devote it to this program that you're going to do in the summer, you certainly could put it down on there. Is it going to help your application? Probably not that much, just because you haven't done it yet. And so the application reader is not going to know whether or not you dropped out of the program or what until they actually invite you to interview. So it's something that I think might be plus or minus. We have other questions coming on here about MD, PhD programs, putting more weight on research than on clinical shadowing. Typically, I would say the answer to that is yes. Obviously, the MD component is still there, so they're going to look for that clinical experience as well. But if you're applying to an MD PhD program, you certainly need to have some pretty strong research background. That doesn't necessarily mean publishing in, the top journals, and hey, if you've done that, then you're a superstar, but that you have a strong experience that comes across in that activities section. Maria, your thoughts?
I agree with everything you said, and I just want to also really reinforce the how you do what you do is everything. And so to Matt's point, that if you have just done, 8 hours here, 8 hours there, or a weekend doing whatever, versus 6 months of really committing yourself, week in and week out, a couple hours a week, it says a lot. It says, if you're only doing a couple hours here and there of something, it says you're a pretty superficial person, as opposed to someone who puts their time and effort where their mouth is. So we do want to see you do fewer things in greater depth than lots of things superficially. As to the future activity, the AMCAS application doesn't allow you to have a start date that's in the future. It allows you to have an end date in the future, but not a start date. And so if you've got an activity that you want to make sure the admissions committees know about that is upcoming, you can send, once they get your application, you can send them an email saying you would like this email describing this activity put into your file. But I totally agree with Matt. Saying that you're going to be doing something in the future doesn't carry a lot of weight with us because we don't know that you're really going to do it. You could say you were going to do anything. And that's pretty much how we take it. Okay, now let's talk about everything else. And this is, I think, the area where applicants have the biggest, toughest time believing that you're really supposed to put down everything else. Anything else that you're passionate about, anything that you have had a commitment towards over an extended period of time, anything to which you have held a leadership role should go down in your activities. The things that I see people forget to list is things like they play a musical instrument. And maybe at one time they did, some competitions. They were a member of a group, maybe a junior symphony. And now they just do it for their own personal pleasure because they've been so much more involved in studying and coursework and other things. And they think, that's not medically related. I'm not going to put that down. Big mistake. Put it down. Or they participate actively in physical exercise or intramural sports. Put that down. Or they have been on the dean's list every quarter. Well, yes, most of you have. Most of you have very strong GPAs. And yes, I can see that it might be a given that most of you have been on the dean's list. But still, if you have not yet been able to fill out all 15 activities on your AMCAS application, that's going to be one of them that you're going to put down. So you're going to use the drop-down menu that comes on the applications. They've got a drop-down menu and they give you all sorts of different categories of which your activities might fit into. Use those drop-down menus as a trigger to help you think about all the things that you have done since you graduated from high school, and list them, because ideally you do want to have your 15 most valuable activities, whether they're medically related or not, is of no importance to us. Again, remember, we're interested in seeing that you're a whole person. We are interested in seeing that you have appropriate outlets for stress relief. And we are looking to see that you are doing lots of other activities while you are getting the grades that you have gotten. Matt, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that this part of it is something that is pretty open. So I see that a lot of you are asking questions about different experiences such as jobs or, certain things in management that you might have done, things outside of medicine. Really, I think that anything can be useful to put on here as long as you structure it in a positive manner, which again is something one-on-one that we would love to work with you guys with and trying to strategically write it, because it may seem easy to list a lot of this stuff out, but as we'll talk about in a few slides, it's pretty I don't want to say tough, but it's time intensive of thinking how to articulate it well. How do you articulate something that you've done well? And really, I like to focus on saying, well, what is it? What did you do specifically? And why is it meaningful to you? And I think like a lot of people tend to not have one of those three. But again, we'll chat about that in a few slides.
Okay, so let's go over the logistics of each of the application's services. So with AMCAS, you can list up to 15 activities. You can have up to 4 occurrences per activity. You need to list the name of the organization, the contact person if the medical school wants to go back and verify your activity, what their title was, your start and end date, estimated number of hours. And then you get 700 characters in which to do a description of what you've done. And in just a moment, we're going to talk about what the content should be. And of the 15, you also then can pick 3 that are your most meaningful. And you get an additional 1,325 characters to talk about why this activity was the most meaningful. And I think, the thing that, again, applicants fall into the mistake is thinking that they must pick activities as their most meaningful that were teaching, research, or clinical. And nothing could be further from the truth. Ideally, you would think that one of your most meaningful activities might be healthcare related, ideally. But the other 2, absolutely not. It can be anything that was meaningful to you, because you're going to have to write about it in a passionate way, and you're going to need to be prepared to talk about it at interview in a passionate way. So don't try to second guess us as to what we think should be the most meaningful. Instead, it needs to be the most meaningful for you. Matt?
The most meaningful activities are something that wasn't there when I applied. And it's something that I think is useful. It's kind of an addition to the personal statement as what you feel really sculpted yourself, your application, your life towards medicine. And so it's something similar to the personal statement that is going to take time to be able to write and articulate well. But again, it comes down to talking about what did you do, what the activity was, why it was meaningful to you. Too often, I see students write down, I studied the application of the 4th generation protein to solving Alzheimer's disease. And I'm like, I have no idea what specifically that you did and why you did it, why it was meaningful to you. That's what admissions committees care about, not about how you might have, found something or led something academically, but why did you do it? Why did you spend time doing it? And what specifically did you do? Because then it gives them an idea of the type of doctor, the type of medical student. Are you going to be a good colleague in medical school? Are you going to be somebody that gets involved in things? Are you going to be fun to work with? Or, do we see you having, certain skill sets and certain ways of thinking that we want for you to bring to the medical school class?
With the ACOMAS application, you again can list up to 15 activities, and it's the same logistics in terms of what was the name of the activity, who's a contact person, how can the medical school reach that person if they need to, what's the number of hours and dates, and you get 700 characters. So you do not pick your 3 most meaningful, but other than that, it's very similar to the AMCAS application. With the Texas application, there's no limit to the activities, and they also want you to list an activity under any category that it could possibly fit, even if that means that you're listing the activity multiple times, as opposed to both AMCAS and the ACOMAS application, you only list the activity once and you pick the category that it seems most fitting. And with the Texas application, you only get 300 characters. So 300 characters is just, 2, maybe 3 sentences. So you're really just giving the facts. Since we're getting close on our time, I'm just going to move along. So what goes into these descriptions, Matt has already covered largely, so we're just going to go really quickly through. These are going to be college and post-college activities, how much time you spent, your responsibilities and accomplishments, the impact you made, the qualities and competencies that you demonstrated. And as we've already talked about, for your AMCAS, it's you're also going to identify your 3 most meaningful. And within that description, it's what did you learn? How did you grow? And ideally, you link that to your future as a physician, that these are insights, qualities, skills, and knowledge that you will take from this activity to influence the way you practice as a physician. And now we're going to turn to the frequently asked questions. Is it okay if I can't or don't fill in all 15 entries? This is a tricky one because all the official literature, and certainly the way my medical school operated, was we were interested in knowing about the things you did, but we're looking for quality over quantity. So if you didn't fill in all 15, but you listed everything that was significant to you in terms of your activities, and you also, were accounting for a lot of those hours outside of the classroom so that we understood that you were doing a number of activities, then the fact that you didn't have 15, maybe you only had 12 or 13 or 14 was just fine. But there are medical schools out there who in their YouTube presentations will say that if you don't have 15 activities, that is reason enough to reject you. And my reaction is, what the, are you kidding me? But as I try to rationalize in my mind what it is they're trying to convey, it's that virtually all of you should have, over the course of 4+ years, that you should have 15 different things that you have done. You just need to jog your memory about what it is that you've done. So seriously, use those drop-down menus of all the different categories for which your activities could fit within, whether it's employment, it's volunteer, it's a hobby, it's leisure activities such as intramural sports, it's the arts, military service. I mean, the list is quite inclusive, and you should use that to jog your memory about the different things you did. And so, yes, I would suggest that you do want to get to 15, but you want to think in terms of that these are the more significant activities as opposed to superficial activities that you did one weekend once during your 4 years of college. Matt, do you have anything to add to that? Oops, I am so
Just
sorry.
not to forget about putting in honors, awards, things like that. Those count as part of the 15. So even though it's not like a quote unquote activity, honors awards are still something that you want to highlight. And again, trying to focus post high school, college only sort of things.
Should I list an activity that's already been discussed in my application essay? Absolutely. You absolutely want to list it, particularly if you don't already have 15 activities. And I would presume that the reason that you'd be writing about it in your application is because it was something significant. So again, you would want to include it in your list of activities, but you probably want to write about it from a little bit different perspective. Don't just take verbatim what you already wrote in your essay. Go do it from a different perspective, highlight a different quality of yours or a different thing that you learned. Matt, anything to add there?
No, that's pretty straightforward.
Okay. This one happens a lot. What if the contact person is no longer there or you don't know who that individual is? You would want to contact the organization, the activity, see who would be a contact person if the medical school wanted to verify the activity or participation in the activity, and find out who you should put down. In a worst case scenario, you can list yourself, but you don't want to have to list yourself because you don't want to have to be the one verifying the activity. But one situation in which I see this happening quite a lot is in the honors and awards, because depending upon your individual undergraduate campus, it could be that even if a medical school contacted the college to say, Sally, was she on the dean's list for these particular quarters, or did they win this particular scholarship? Many undergraduate campuses are going to say to the medical school, I'm sorry, under FERPA, we cannot, that's a federal education and privacy law, we cannot say anything about that because we consider that to be part of the academic record. Well, if they're not going to verify it for you and it's not listed on your transcript and you don't have anything else official that the medical school could go to look at, then the only way they can possibly verify it is to come back to you. Now, what are the chances that the medical school is going to want to verify any activity? I'd say it's less than 1%. The only reason they're going to want to verify an activity is if something just doesn't make sense. That your application, there are dates, there are things that you have said between your primary application and your secondary application or the interview that are in conflict. And if anything is in conflict, we're going to go back and verify. Matt, anything to add?
No, that pretty much covers it all. Trying to figure out who the contact person is, just be as honest as you possibly can be in listing these activities. You don't want any chance of a red flag coming up on your application thinking that you lied or provided incorrect contact info. Trust me, admissions people will contact these people. Don't think that it's just some random line that they just want you to put the info in there for nothing. They will get in touch with some of these people. So, don't underestimate that.
So can you list activities that were done after college? Absolutely. It's post high school on that the medical schools are interested in. So if you are a non-traditional student, we would expect you to tell us what you've been doing recently. And if that's something that you want to write about in your essay, that may be very appropriate, but it's also going to be appropriate to list these things in your work and activity section of your application. How about, should you list hobbies, honors, non-medically related activities? Yes, we've already said that. That's why these are categories in the drop-down menu for you to select from in which to say that this activity fits into this category. It's because the medical schools do want to know about these things. Should you list all of your activities that are related under one heading? That totally depends. One is if you've got, you haven't already filled up your 15 activities, and then you might want to split them up. If you have a number of things that you did briefly, then yes, you would probably want to group them together if they're very similar. Let's say you shadowed 5 different physicians on 5 different occurrences for 8 hours each. Well, it would be totally appropriate to list all of those under one category. And do your most meaningful activities need to be medically related? Absolutely not. That said, I would imagine that for most of you, that you're going to have a medically related activity that is one of your most meaningful, because this is when you went and tested your motivation. But if it wasn't one of your most meaningful, please do not select to write about that as though it were, because you're going to run out of things to say, and it's not going to come across as being one of your most meaningful. We're looking for those things that shaped you, and we want to know how and why and how this is going to influence your future as a physician. Matt?
That pretty much covers it well. Just take care in selecting what the most meaningful activities are. And again, just like, we've been chatting about, these are things that on our one-on-one admission sessions that we'll have with you guys, trying to strategically pick out, okay, here are the activities that you want to include, and then being able to talk through, well, which ones do you like the most? Which ones do you think were most kind of forming for you? Which ones made the light bulb go off and said, man, I really want to, be a doctor. I really want to go into medicine. I love doing this stuff. Well, why do you love it? Why is it meaningful to you? Why did it make you kind of transition and say, hey, I want to go into the medical field? Those are the ones that can come across more as the meaningful activities than something that might just be, I made the dean's list. That might not be as meaningful to you as someone else. And when you think about it, you want to be strategic in how you're presenting it, just like everything else in the application to the admissions directors, and seeing, well, what does this student consider to be most meaningful, and being able to think about that carefully. Is if you select something to be most meaningful, what will the admissions committee member think about that? Will that resonate with him or her? So again, these things, they take time and good planning to articulate well.
So as you go forward in your application process to medical school, we wish you every success. And if you need help along the way, just know that we are here to help, and we offer individual hours as well as packages. And so I'm sure that if you reach out and talk to us, that we can let you know what the best option for you might be. But Matt and I really look forward to getting to know you better in the future.
Yeah, so we have some time left for some questions. I'm going to get to some of the ones that you guys jumped on, but just to kind of reiterate what Maria said with some of our packages there. So the chat screen that you guys are on, if you look to the top of the chat screen, you'll see two links: learn more for the specific packages. That's the CAP test link. And then the second one is the futuredoctor.youcanbookme.me. And clicking on that link will be able to direct you to a time slot where whatever works easiest for you guys, you can select a time slot, and someone from Kaplan will call you to discuss, what your needs specifically are. We want to provide to all of you exactly what it is that you need. So if you're just looking for help on the personal statement, boom, we got it. We're there for you. If you want help from start to finish on the whole application, we're there for you. If you want help on the interviewing, the secondaries, anything like that, Kaplan and we can work with you to customize a great package. But in some time that we have left here, let's jump into some of these questions. Hopefully a lot of the ones that you guys have been asking, I think that we jumped in with a lot of Maria's slides. So just give me a sec here. Let me see some of these. So this one kind of stood out to me by Abby. If you list a hobby, who would you put as the contact person? I think that's a fun question because, I work out for a hobby. So who do I put in for my contact person? My gym supervisor or something. Yeah, I mean, I really don't know an answer to that, Maria. Would you have any insight to that?
Well, sure. If you happen to have had a personal trainer along the way, or again, someone who can verify that you actually do this activity, that would be great. But if you don't, then you put yourself. And this does kind of highlight, though, going back to how you do what you do. So ideally, you take these things that you enjoy doing and then you share them with others, whether it's because you've always got a workout buddy that you are encouraging them to make sure that they get up every morning to go to the gym, or maybe you've been a member of a running club and you participate in their clinics that they put on to teach other people how to run. So there are oftentimes like the quality of how you do will provide you with someone who can verify, because it's someone who's benefited from your knowledge.
That's great. There was a question earlier we had from one of our students about if the letters need a date on them, that if her letters don't have a date, will they not be reviewed because of this? So it was my assumption that most letters, just most formal business letters, are going to have a date on them. I suppose if your letter writers didn't put a date, the first thing I would think of is, well, if you submitted them to a pre-health committee, they might date them. If you submitted them to AMCAS is not going to know when the letter actually got written. I don't think that would disqualify them, but let's ask the insider here, Maria, to see what she says.
Yes. So the medical schools want a current date. Current meaning within 6 months of the time that they are reviewing that letter of recommendation, because we want to make sure that the person still feels the same way about you, and that it's not that you've turned into an axe murderer in the meantime. So yes, you need to have a date on those letters. And this is something that all of us here on the admissions consulting side, that we work with applicants one-on-one to figure out, just what is there a hole somewhere in their letters? Is there a hole in their extracurricular activities? Is there a better way to present some aspect of their application?
One of the questions that we had is, do we have to have a letter from a physician? Do we have to shadow a doctor? So one of the things that Maria spoke about for the osteopathic application was, yes, to have a letter from an osteopathic physician. I know the same is not the case for the AMCAS. Do we have to shadow a doctor? Well, certainly I didn't when I was in your shoes. And I don't think it's an absolute requirement, but as Maria said, admissions committees are generally looking for that one of the big three, the clinical experience. So it would be just probably a little strange if you didn't have the shadowing or at least some equivalent form of medical experience.
And there are medical schools now that are requiring shadowing. So again, you're going to go back to the MSAR database, or look at each individual medical school's website, or look at the secondary in the application in your pre-med office to find out what are they requiring. And this is something that's kind of new. It used to be the medical schools did not require clinical experience. They kind of reasonably expected it, but they didn't require it, as Matt is an example. But there certainly are schools now that are requiring shadowing. And you need to know what the medical schools that you plan to apply to, what they're looking for.
One of the classic questions just came up in, how many hours would you consider I should get for shadowing that would be ideal? Always a great question is to try to quantify what admissions directors like Maria are looking for with hours. Personally, I would say it's best not to be the minimum person in terms of, like we talked about, having that long-term commitment. So not just doing a weekend or, 2 weeks or 3 weeks here or there. I would assume that as long as you have a longitudinal experience of kind of looking for that 6-month time range, that's probably of utmost importance, rather than saying, well, that candidate's got 1,000 hours and that one only has 500. So clearly there's one better than the other. I don't know, Maria, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, put yourself in our position. Would you be impressed with you if someone said, I want to be a doctor, but I've only done 8 hours of clinical exposure, or I've only done 20 hours of clinical exposure. So whether you're talking shadowing or some other type of clinical work, whether it's paid or volunteer, would you be impressed by this, that somebody really has an idea of what they're getting into, and that they have demonstrated by their actions that this is what they want to do with their life, that this is a calling, this is something they're passionate about, as opposed to this is just a job they're applying for?
That's great. One of the questions from earlier is, does the request for a letter only get sent after you've submitted the application or once you list them as a recommender? So that's a great question. The answer to that is the second that you put them in the application itself, you have the opportunity to print off a form to be able to send them or electronically to send them. When I was applying, there was no electronic upload, so I had to use snail mail for all of this and make sure my letter writers had postage and everything like that. Nowadays, thankfully, in the modern age, away from the Stone Age, makes me feel so old. Now letter writers can just upload the letters electronically, which is huge. It should make it easier, unless you've got those kind of on the older end letter writers that are not as technologically adept, but they can still use snail mail if they need to. So it's something that the moment that that application opens, you should be able to put in your letter writer's info, generate an ability for them to upload a letter or send in a letter and go from there. Again, it's something that we at Kaplan want to help you get those letters ready to go so that as soon as that application is open, boom, you put them in there, the letter writers can upload them and they're good to go. Because like we said, it takes time.
Although I'd like to also add, just in case the nuance of the question was, is your application considered incomplete if you don't yet have your letters of recommendations into the application servicer? So when you file your AMCAS application or your ACOMAS application or your Texas application, your application, you don't have to have the letters there at that time for your application to be forwarded on to the medical schools. You do have to have your transcripts, your academic history has to have been verified. You need to have your list of schools that you want your application sent to, but you don't need your letters until the medical schools start to send you secondaries, in which case then you've got to have the letters to be able to have your secondaries completed. Now, the unfortunate, if you will, thing is that most medical schools now are automatically sending secondaries to everyone, which means you're going to get those requests from the medical schools for your letters within a week to 2 weeks after the application gets sent to the medical schools. That most medical schools will then immediately send you a secondary and be asking for those letters of recommendations. So given that it takes AMCAS usually about a month to verify your academic history, you've got about a month to get those letters in.
Great. So in our final few minutes here, Maria, if you could leave our students here with one last word of wisdom, piece of advice, thing to kind of sum up the session.
Oh my, applying to medical school is certainly a marathon. It's not a sprint. From the time you submit your application until the time you go to medical school, about 14 months will have passed, and a lot happens during that time. There is a lot of interaction that you're going to have with each of the medical schools that you've applied to. And that time management is really important. Understanding what's being asked of you is really important. Practicing for your interviews is really important. Actually verbalizing and saying out loud the responses that you would give to a committee. And most all of us need a coach to help us understand what's being expected of us and how we can present in the best possible light. So whether you're using your pre-med officer or a faculty member that you're close to, or us, just know that we're all here to help you at whatever stage of the application process you're in and with whatever help you need.
That's great. And, just to add in, as somebody that's been through the experience not once but twice, it's something that is tough. I understand what you guys are going through so much, and it's part of the reason why I do this, because it was a difficult process and it's something that requires a lot of work. And tonight we only focused on two things, and that was the letters of recommendation and the extracurriculars, the activities section. Those are only two components of the application, which is massive, and there's many, many different things that come with it. We hope that a lot of the things that we talked about tonight shed some insight, especially from the insider herself, Maria here, who, this is such a great opportunity for you guys to learn from. I mean, I certainly did not have this, and it's just so awesome that we have somebody like Maria who's had this experience, and hopefully with me living some of the experience on the under end of things, that you guys could take away a lot of good things, because our goal tonight is just to help you guys succeed. That's our reason for being here. At the end of the day, when I'm done at the hospital, I come home and I want to do this because I was in your guys' shoes, and I struggled and I worked hard, and I turned to Kaplan when I was in your guys' shoes, and Kaplan helped me out immensely. And that's why I'm here as part of Kaplan today, saying that I'm here, Maria's here, we have a whole team of consultants here. No matter what it is that you need help with, we have a package for you. We have the time, we have the opportunity to make you, again, write your success story. So we have, a few other sessions like this coming up in the next month or two. We hope to see you guys again, but until then, it's been our pleasure to have you guys with us here tonight. Thank you so much for taking the time. And again, we wish you the best of success from all of us here at Kaplan. Have a wonderful night and good luck on the journey ahead.